right. Thanks so much, Danny, and thanks to everybody out there. Again, if you came in late, put where you're from. It's just fun to see where everybody's landing from today. And yeah, welcome to July webinar, end of July. I don't know about you, but the summer has just flown by. The the signs of the season change are happening even just this morning while I was sitting here getting ready. A flock of geese flew over in their V formation, going wherever they go. The cicadas are doing their thing. So clearly we're in a new part of the season. And yeah, just happy to have you here today. Danny, if you'll give the agenda, I'll kind of overview where we're going today. Again, I'm going to talk some about where I am in my bee season, just so that'll give you a point of reference for where you are as well. We're going to talk about some of the things that you probably want to think about this time of year with your beekeeping, and we can answer questions in Q&A for that as well, or just drop them in the chat. I also want to give an update. We've been tracking with part of my business here with my farm is Sourwood honey, and it's kind of a unique, varietal honey production that people are interested in. So I just want to give a recap of where we are at that. In our last webinar, we had just moved into Sourwood, so we were anticipating great things, and so now we will have to sober that up with what the reality of is what happened. So we'll be talking about that as well. And then we're going to go to Joe, as we call him here within the HiveTracks universe, and talk about biodiversity and how you as a beekeeper are really a sentinel in that understanding of biodiversity with the work that you do with the bees and what your bees do. And this is really showing the direction of where HiveTracks is going. And I think you'll see the benefit for you as a beekeeper. This is going to make it so we can provide the best HiveTracks tool that's going to give you a lot of value as a beekeeper, just for doing what you love to do, being a beekeeper. So can't wait to get to that section as well. And then again, we have Q&A at the end for whatever is on your mind. Okay, so let's get going. So an update from the farm. Last time I was at 45-ish hives. I'm at 50-ish now. I made some splits recently. We'll talk about that in a minute, about why I did that or why you would do that this time of year. And so I have, again, a mix of my production hives. I have these hives in these backyard beehive client locations. Had a bunch of dinks last time that were kind of iffy hives. I've cleaned all those up and I made some splits. We're also finishing up the Sourwood process. Really, it ended about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, but we're finishing up, pulling the honey off, getting those hives back to the farm. And part of that process is creating honey stories, which again is a precursor to what we're going to do, hopefully in August. And then last time I talked about this pollinator patch that I created for a project with NC State. That's going fantastic, actually, and they're coming out to count pollinators this week. Then also we're going to talk about, or here at the farm, what's blooming now as part of just being a good beekeeper, of noticing the change in the environment for your bees. And like most of you all, we're transitioning out of these spring, summer flowers into more of the fall varieties as well. So first, let's go on and talk about Sourwood. Oh, by the way, that image, that's my morning sit spot to have breakfast and yeah, think about things. So it's a nice place. All right, Sourwood season recap. Last time we talked about really for any kind of honey production, but for Sourwood in particular, there are these key elements. You got to have the bees, you got to have good bloom and nectar, which we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the weather itself is a big factor, right? We are beholden to the whims of the weather as a nature-based business, if you will, with beekeeping or agricultural-based business. The seasons and the weather, all those are the elements that we can't have much control over, and that often are the biggest variable in our beekeeping. So overall season result is kind of below average production. The honey that we did get, it's really nice. I mean, it's good sourwood. There is some potential variation in color. A lot of folks I talked about, there was a little bit of stuff mixing in, so it's super tough to really sort out all those frames to make sure you don't get any little darker stuff. There's some mimosa around that gets mixed in, but it's really nice honey if you were able to get it. So the weather itself this year. Oh, sorry. The weather itself was pretty variable. It went from really hot to kind of normal, but then a lot of thunderstorms and things in the area, at least where my yards were, which had a big effect on it. So let's look at some pictures now from that process. On the left is a group of hives that are in one of my sourwood yards. The one in the back with all the supers, it was way over supered. They didn't make all those. It looks impressive, but it's not that impressive. But the hives themselves that were there were pretty strong, and we're ready to rock and roll. Then you see in the middle, this is an image of sourwood bloom. If you've never seen it, again, it blooms from one end to the other. This one is well into getting into the bloom and looking fantastic. On the right is a radar image, and the two red dots in the middle of the heavy storms are directly over top of my two sourwood yards. So that's just the way it works, right? And I have it memorized. If you're in this space, you know where your yards are on the weather map, right? And so you can quickly look and see what's going on. And so this happened kind of, on a regular basis, especially towards the end of the sourwood flow, which again, anytime you get this, it makes a little bit of a dent in a little bit of a dent in the production. So, all right, next slide. Now this is another yard that was under one of those dots, and these hives were all packages or fresh new hives, so I really wasn't expecting a whole lot out of these. Now this yard actually did halfway decent. And I'm getting ready to show you a hive scale. I'm a fan of them for monitoring the flow in sourwood in particular. And so the hive that's closest to us in this image is what I'm going to show on this next slide. And you will notice too that it's got a queen excluder. It's got a deep and a medium, and then a queen excluder. I almost always run just single deeps, but that one I had a bunch of brood up in that medium. When I was starting the hives, I wasn't able to clear it out. Anyway, so if you'll go to the next slide, Danny, we'll see what the production was like in this yard. And for that particular hive, you can see that there's a plus of 46 over from the early part of this. You see the peak of the sourwood production, and then you see how it starts tailing off. It's done, right? So when it flattens out, it's done. That's usually when we pull the honey and move the hives out. I've been a little bit delayed in getting to that, but you can see they begin to eat the honey that they've got stored in that hive. So again, this was halfway decent, and that particular yard is my historical best yard. It almost never fails, but there were a lot of other places around that I know either the sourwood ended early or it just didn't produce as much. There were beautiful blooms. A buddy of mine had some hives that had wonderful looking bloom, and the weather was okay, but they just weren't producing nectar, and so they didn't make honey there. All right, so that's the sourwood update from my side, and again, across the board, just from other people that I talked to, it's been sort of a down year. I'm sure there are spots that were really good. In fact, I'm going to show you one here in a minute that was actually pretty darn good. Is a new spot for me. One thing that we did notice that the higher elevation or mid elevation, really the 2,000-ish feet elevation yards did better than the lower elevation yards. All right, Danny. So this is more of that of the Sourwood update, just with images. You can see on the far left, this is what you love to see in your supers when you're making Sourwood or any honey, really, when you get that white on the edges. And this was a fresh, clean super, foundation only. The middle picture is an experiment I was doing with an 8-frame hive, just putting 7 frames in it. So there's a lot of space. So you can see there's really fat frames in there, some really nice honey. The problem with this one was it was in a Sourwood location, but it had had some spring honey in it, so it got mixed. All right. Now on the right is the honey coming out of the extractor, and that dusty little brown color, that's really what you want. Or for me, in our Sourwood locations, that's what it looks like. As far as color and the flavor, is typical Sourwood. And then below is my first Sourwood jars at the farmer's market itself. All right, Danny. Okay, so given, Sourwood is part of what we've been doing, and we've got other bees as well in the area. They've done kind of okay. There's some places that have just not been good at all. In fact, I would rate them as a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of how their season has been. And then there are others that are, just a few miles away that are doing okay. By the way, let me take a time out here, and in the chat, if you would rate your honey production this year from 1 to 5, 5 being the best ever, 1 being the worst ever. How was your honey production this year? Let's just see what it looks like for everybody. So put it there in the chat if you would, and I'll keep talking. All right. Ooh, 5s and 5s. The ones who have 5s, they're very quick to put their numbers there. That's how beekeepers are. All right. Yeah, keep doing that. And mine is from 1 to 4. There may have been a 4 here and there. I'll show you one in a minute that I think was a 4. But what happens now? We had early in the season, you have a lot of enthusiasm, you have plans, you have this is what I think it's going to be like, and now we're kind of having to evaluate this is what it was like. The bees themselves are quickly transitioning into fall mode. If you've been in your bees, they're beginning to shrink in population. Maybe you've harvested the honey already. If you haven't, you probably need to go ahead and do that soon. And then we need to start looking towards winter. And part of that is varroa management, making sure you have healthy bees going into the winter. And so low varroa loads, if you can get that, certainly is helpful. So I want to remind you that go look at the Honeybee Health Coalition. Their tools and their resources for managing varroa just are a valuable and trustworthy place for information about varroa. Some of that's getting a little dated, and there's some newer products on the market now that you can work into the mix, but it's still a good tool. So, all right, next slide, Danny. Okay, other things that I'm doing in my bee operation with Faith Mountain Farm. So the Sourwood is one big piece, but I've got these backyard beehives that are clients, and they're scattered about in the high country. And so one of those places is this blueberry patch, Old Orchard Creek, you see in the upper left. I ended up splitting every single one of those colonies, and I got some new queens in. A buddy of mine got some, and I got some from him. They're from Olivares. They're Randy Oliver stock. And so it's not a bad time to create some splits that you're going to overwinter as nukes, or maybe you get a single.
You came in.
And so in the bottom left, that's those queens. And then in the middle, you can see where I made a split. This one had 2 frames of brood and 1 of food. And then I'm adding the queen in on the right. You can see they're already a pretty good population of bees. So that's one little subplot, if you will, of my beekeeping operation. And there's different schools of thought about splitting this time of year. It is getting close to being too late, but you can do it. All right, next slide. So another thing that I've been doing with my operation is, given my location in the mountains, which is typically cooler than the off the mountain, we call it, lower elevations. I mean, getting into the 80s is a heat wave. And recently in North Carolina, there was a pretty big heat wave. Charlotte was 100 for 2 days in a row. We were in the 80s, so it wasn't too hot to do Formic Pro, which is what this is right here. So sometimes coming out of Sourwood, we want to go ahead and treat and get those mite levels down. You may have to use a different option if you want to go ahead and treat now. We like to go ahead and get those mite levels knocked down because we have a shorter window in the fall for getting ready for winter. And northern areas do the same thing. They have to transition really fast from summer honey production into varroa control before getting ready for winter, especially the Canadian folks. All right, next slide. Now, as Danny said, we're going to most likely talk about honey stories more in depth next webinar. But I wanted to share an example right here. So if you take your phone, if you're not watching on your phone, then you can hit this QR code and it will take you to a honey story example. And this is a real example from real hives that I just made, in the last week or so. And this is for a location called Turtle Island Preserve. It's a very fascinating, unique place. Eustace Conway, he was on some TV shows about mountain men. He was in a book, but this is a property that is his, and they run camps and kind of tools, learning how to use blacksmith tools, things like that. And I have some hives there. And so I created a honey story for the hives that are there. It's in a pretty pristine area. Just you have to drive down this long road to get kind of in the bottom of this valley to get to these bees in this location. And they made actually really good honey this year. And so I wanted to use them as an example of this honey story. So I created the honey story, harvested in early July. And if you go to that honey story, you'll see a history of all those hives all the way back to when I first put the hives in there. So if you want to see the story of how this honey was created, then you can go and see the progression of those hives and how they developed at that location. When I collected the honey, you'll see hive scale images, things like that. So this is an example of what you could do with your bees, with your harvest as well. So if you'll go to the next slide, just a couple of pictures from that location. Oh, first, this was the scale from there. And this was, I was super excited when I saw this one. It was from 75 up to 150. So 75 pounds in this, window of time. And this was an 8-frame new hive coming out of spring. So next slide. Clearly the hive on the left is the one that was the production hive. The other one actually went queenless, and it's queen right now and doing well. But all the honey from this location is going to come from that one big hive. And you can see the broken honey there in between the supers. It's that nice sourwood color. And yeah, I just pulled the frames out of that one of those supers for an early harvest to get this honey story. So again, just an example. If you haven't done a honey story, then you should try it. Okay. And the precursor to doing a honey story is keeping good records. So as long as you're keeping up with your hives and do those harvest records, then you can create a honey story later. And you can tailor that honey story if you go and look at that honey story I gave you. The content that's in there, it's customizable. You put the pictures in there, you put the text in there for the talking about the honey or talking about the place that you made the honey. You can even talk about the purpose of the honey itself. Like maybe it's a wedding gift favor or something, or it's to your friends and family, and you want to share about your love of bees and tell them about what you're doing. You can do that in that honey story. So it's a really cool feature that we like. So, all right, that's pretty much my update. And again, if you have any questions about what I'm doing or why I'm doing something, feel free to put those in the chat or come back to them at the Q&A time. But right now, we're going to go to Joe, and for this really cool stuff that we're doing with HiveTracks. And this image here, this is that pollinator patch that I told you about from NC State that I planted, and it's beginning to bloom now. And it's one of those spots that I would say I'm increasing the biodiversity in my area through this pollinator plot. So, Joe, over to you.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and that patch would be a great use for the the HiveTracks app with all the new biodiversity bits we're getting in there. Go ahead, next slide, Danny. So for those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Joe, and you might be wondering why HiveTracks has a biodiversity specialist. You know, we started off just focused on bees and apiaries, and it kind of feels like we're branching into something new. And it's because we are. If you guys were at the webinar last month with Terralyn, we talked a lot about permaculture and beekeeping. And there's just so much overlap between running a good apiary and regenerative agriculture and conservation and, tracking that quality habitat. As James said earlier, you guys are out there. You guys are really looking at the environment and because bees are a really nice biosensor. Like they're quite sensitive to their environment and they tell you a lot about your environment. Uh, Being in that close of connection to those bees puts you in a situation where you kind of have your finger on the pulse of the habitat there. So our aim is to move into making sure that this tool not only works for honey management and hive management, but also habitat management. And where the overlap of a beekeeper and biodiversity monitoring and biodiversity uplift lie. So I'll be talking about some new tools in the HiveTracks app, as well as the direction we're going with the HiveTracks Pro dashboard. And then I'm going to touch on some more applied components of this. So how does biodiversity relate to your backyard or your apiary and how HiveTracks is working to make that information more accessible, as well as some really cool field trials that I'm extremely excited about, showing how beekeepers can really work as biodiversity monitors, and kind of shake up what being a beekeeper can mean to you and your community. Next slide. So the new tools in the app, you might have seen these. I'm sure a lot of you have made an apiary in the HiveTracks app, but you can also make a biodiversity site. It's the same method, and if you've made a site, you can see these site monitoring tools that are on the right. We have four of them right now. There's kind of the two easy tools, and then the two more advanced tools. The easy tools, point and shoot, take a photo, we'll identify it, we'll library it, we'll analyze it. And that's the document flora and document pollinator. And that's realistically what 95% of you will be using. We also have the advanced tools, which is the pollinator count and the flora abundance. The pollinator count is based on fit count, which is a standardized method for monitoring pollinators in Europe. And the flora abundance is just a step-by-step guide for how to do a vegetation quadrat. Um, you don't need to know all that unless you really want to get into the science of ecological monitoring. And if you are interested, there's videos if you click on either of those advanced tools that will walk you through that. But I'll give some examples of how we're using the advanced tools later on. Go ahead, Danny. So we're working on dashboard updates as well right now in Pro. So there's the updated floral and pollinator inventory. It was kind of there before, but now we have progressively more and more of those metrics coming in. So if you're the type of person who wants to take a picture of the pollinators you see in your apiary, you see a flower you maybe don't recognize, you snap a photo of it. Not only do you get the identification on the spot, but you get this inventory built out on your Pro dashboard, so you can get a really good idea of what's going on your site. And then we're working on these meta-analyses. There's already a few here that I've given as examples, which are ranges of metrics to help you understand your biodiversity on site. The goal is to understand the year-on-year changes in your apiary, what's going on, is it a good year, is it a bad year, and are those changes that you might be doing in how you're managing the space leading to more biodiversity, leading to more nectar sources, leading to more or better quality pollen sources. Those are the types of things we're building out in the dashboard right now. Next slide. This is what's coming soon. It's just a little teaser of what's going on the back end of HiveTracks right now. A bunch of enhanced metrics for beekeepers. So, you see in the top left corner the blooming updates, what should be blooming in your area now, as well as the inventory with all this extra information, what type of pollen source is it, how drought tolerant is it, and is it endangered? Is your apiary acting as a place where threatened or endangered species can thrive? Which ultimately is one of the points of measuring biodiversity, right? Making sure that we're preventing any risk of extinction of these beautiful animals in our area. Um, Y'all have been asking for a very long time, and we are very excited to tell you that we're making progress on an estimated blooming calendar. We're looking at some different AI models. So what would happen is anything that's photographed in your floral inventory, we would take the location of that photo just from the photo's metadata and then compare the region that the photo was taken in to the average blooming period of that plant to get a contextualized to your site calendar of what's probably in bloom at that moment. Of course, if you're on the north facing side of a slope or for whatever reason, you're in a really niche habitat within that area. It might be a little off from that. But in order to plan your apiary, understand when you have big nectar flows, when you might have dearths, as well as whether your season is fully extending into the spring and into the fall with nectar and pollen availability. It's a really cool tool. I'm super excited for it. We're getting the pieces together for it. And that's not only for your own bees, but for the wider pollinator communities that your apiary is supporting. Like, how can you extend and diversify the available nectar and pollen all year long? This tool can really help with that. And then with oh yeah, thanks, Danny. Just with the biodiversity in your apiary, why does this matter? I moved around this slide for a little bit. I could put 10 different links to different articles of scientific literature saying diverse sources of pollen help bees manage pesticide resilience. Diverse sources of pollen and nectar allow native pollinators to better meet their nectar needs, even if you have a really heavy honeybee load on your site. Diverse pollen and nectar help with disease and stress. But ultimately, we kind of all know this. If you think about it for yourself, if you only ate one food for a full year, you'd probably be pretty sick. The pesticides or the chemicals and the potential diseases in your area would probably get to you. Um, and the same applies for your bees. Whether you're doing some custom wildflower honey or whether you just want to make sure that your bees are getting the best nutrition possible, a diverse diet means better nutrition. And again, not only for you, but for the pollinators that your habitat's supporting. This better data lets you better plan your apiary. So you can see the nectar flows, you can see how diverse your foraging sources are. Maybe everything that you have is actually just in the mint family. It's a bunch of mints and salvias. You can maybe mix in some asters or some rose family sources that you can have that greater diversity of nutrition for your bees. And you wouldn't know that without the data. You as beekeepers are very familiar with your sites, but there's the old adage, what you don't measure, you don't manage. And these new tools really make that so much more accessible and really put all that information into one spot with some pre-analysis already done to make sure it's useful to you as a beekeeper. And of course, to support broader pollination health and conservation. Like I was saying earlier, there's a lot of overlap between apiaries and regenerative agriculture. You as beekeepers understand how important habitat health is to human health, to your own business. And we know that if you're tending a piece of land, there's that intrinsic benefit of making sure it works for conservation on a wider scale. And the better data you have, the better you can plan for that. Go ahead, Danny. And this is where I'm personally quite excited. And this is a big focus of HiveTracks this year and moving forward is beekeepers as biodiversity monitors. So this is our first year of launching the program. But the idea is we've created this app to a scale that the average beekeeper can collect high quality data from a site across multiple biodiversity metrics. So there's the advanced tools in the app that I mentioned, the step-by-step guide for doing a vegetation quadrat, and step-by-step guide for doing a fit count, a standardized way to understand the abundance and diversity of pollinators on a site. Um, all the information that you put into the app when you're measuring your hive's health is also habitat data. The hive acts as a biosensor and tells us about the overall environmental quality of the area. So really, we're just one or two steps away from having beekeepers be these ecological monitors on these different sites. So what we've done is set up standardized sampling procedures for beekeepers in a few different contexts. They go out, they set up their hives, and whenever they go out to check on their hives, they, spend an hour or so collecting this additional environmental data. So beekeepers can keep hives on site, kind of giving you access to new apiaries, and it's an additional income source for beekeepers because you're basically a paid ecologist at this point as well. And then we're creating this really high quality environmental data set for the customers who want to be doing environmental monitoring. Next slide. So again, this is our first year and we're doing it at a few sites, but I wanted to highlight the two main uses that we've come across this first year, where we realized that our tool and beekeepers as biodiversity monitors are just a great fit. And that's agrivoltaics and restoration. I'll get into the use cases we have of that this year. But to bring it all together, the beekeeper uses the app just to monitor their apiary and monitor the habitat. All that information goes into the dashboard, and we can use all those metrics in the dashboard to create a really high quality snapshot of on-site biodiversity with data that's collected throughout the entire season, data that gets collected at a higher resolution, and the beekeepers get paid, the bees have access to new land, and just quite frankly, you're out in the field a lot more frequently than a paid ecologist might be. You're lucky if you get an ecologist to go out once a year to monitor pollinators. So it really is a win-win-win. Next slide. So agrivoltaics, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the idea of combining agriculture with solar farms. The solar farms, if you didn't take any of this into account, would be sadly just lawns that get mowed once or twice a year. And it's such a waste of resource. There's still plants that can grow under and around the solar panels, and so it offers a lot of potential for actually functioning as a habitat, as long as there's the incentive for that. And putting an apiary on a solar farm works fantastically. It's already quite an open prairie type habitat. And by having that apiary there, it really incentivizes wildflower mixes instead of just a monoculture of grass there. It incentivizes the bare minimum mowing required for the solar panels to function, which we all know that the less you mow, the more habitat you have, the more biodiversity, the higher quality soil in the area. It's just an easy win, and it's a lot easier to sell that win when those beehives are there. I know we've been talking to a lot of solar developers, and a lot of them love the idea of having bees on their farm or on their solar development too, just because, quite frankly, it looks good. Not only is it better for the environment and better economically because there's um, multiple styles of economics on the same site. It just looks better having a wildflower field around the solar panels. Some states also have requirements or grants or incentives for creating quality habitat around a solar farm, but it needs to be monitored and there needs to be data to show that you're creating quality habitat. Perfect fit for what we're talking about. So this year we've connected some beekeepers to a few solar farms. They go out, they create an apiary, they keep their hives. And then with that high frequency live collected data all season, we can support the sustainable development and management of this solar. Solar is green energy, but it can also be green habitat management. And of course, diversifying the income sources for beekeepers, especially small scale beekeepers, is really important to HiveTracks as just a value. Next slide. And then the restoration sites. There's a lot of we hear about habitat restoration, but a lot of times it's cleaning up a damaged habitat. We've found some landowners who've done all the required restoration for a site, but they want to make sure that the sites are still functioning as true ecosystems. They're not just ticking the boxes of this habitat is restored. They want to see the function returned as well. And we have a really great project structure for sites like this. We'll be doing the monitoring with the beekeepers with their apiaries on site for the next 3 years. Year one, baseline assessment of biodiversity. Yes, this habitat is restored, but are we seeing multiple types of pollinators? What's the floral diversity of the site? What's the vegetation coverage like? Do we have any endangered species? What percent is native? So we get that baseline from year one. And then at the end of year one, we'll use the dashboard to analyze the results and come up with a series of recommendations for how we can make these restored sites function more like a proper ecosystem. Um, Once we have that baseline assessment done, in year two, the landowners will implement the changes based on year one reports. So in some of those situations, again, it's changed management practices like reduced herbicides, reduced mowing, etc. Sometimes it's this particular area is the right habitat niche to attract X, Y, and Z endangered pollinators. You just need to make sure A, B, and C species are there because they're critical for the habitat of these pollinators we want to bring back in. It might just be you need more native plants, pieces like that, but we won't be able to make those recommendations until we have that data from year one. So then year two, we implement those changes, and year three, we look at improved overall habitat function through species abundance and diversity, through an increase in native species, through longer flowering seasons, and ideally through the arrival of more rare and unusual species. And of course, the hive health, the bee foraging distance, the pollinator diversity, they all tell this meta story of habitat analysis. Next slide, Danny. So what's next in terms of this biodiversity pathway for HiveTracks? For those of you who maybe haven't heard about this project yet, I'm sure this is coming as a bit of a surprise because it may seem like it's deviating from apiary management, but from our perspective, it's really not. It's adding new layers to apiary management so that beekeepers can access new industries, so that beekeepers can tend their land with more information, and so that we can, again, continue to build these bridges between beekeeping and conservation. Um, so we're working on tools to increase the quality of forage at solar farms. Again, how do we analyze the data more efficiently that gets collected on these different sites? And so instead of it just being this list of numbers that's on your pro dashboard, whether it's for your apiary or for a solar farm, the more analyses we can build into that, the more useful the information is directly to you. We're working to connect beekeepers with other types of habitat restoration projects. We're looking at schools, we're looking at parks, we're looking at biophilic construction projects where they want homes to feel like they're part of the ecosystem, and the honeybees can show what the habitat really looks like for the people living there. And of course, we'll be doing interviews with beekeepers to really understand how we can make sure that this data is useful to you and how we can make sure that the tools are as intuitive and as natural as they can be to a beekeeper. Again, this is our first year. We've run into some hiccups. We've learned some really great lessons about what makes a tool accessible and what makes a tool, quite frankly, fun for the user. So we're continuously improving, and it's just been such an exciting year to launch a really cool project that I think we're all excited about. And hopefully, you guys can play with the tools, play with the dashboard if you're using HiveTracks Pro, and give us feedback. Let us know what biodiversity information you'd want for your site and how we can better display that on the dashboard. You know, that's the only way we can really make sure it works for everyone. But yeah, we're looking forward to seeing where this biodiversity journey takes us. Go ahead, Danny.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you so much, James, as well. I think we have a little bit of time for some questions. Maybe we get started with the questions that were submitted in the registrations first, which we've pre-prepared here. But please, as well, if any thoughts, comments, feedback, questions came up throughout Joe or James's session today, pop them in the chat and we will also get to those hopefully with the remainder of the 15 minutes. Perhaps we start with the first one from you, Joe. How do you determine if forage is sufficient?
I might pass that
Combination
back
of
to James,
James
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
and
from
Joe.
at least,
Let you fight.
yeah, at least from a biodiversity perspective, sufficient means something different for an ecologist versus a
Right.
beekeeper. But what I would say is sufficient forage is you want to look at having the early blooming and the late blooming plants. You know, there might be dearths in the middle of summer or something like that, but a lot of those specialist pollinators that are more sensitive to changes in habitat or unusual weather patterns are more likely the early foragers more than anything else, and as well as some late foragers. So uh, you want to look at what's native to your area, especially because um, a lot of these more endangered pollinators are specialists and specialists on the edges. So I'm thinking willow, I'm thinking crocus, I'm thinking um uh if you're up in the PNW, like Mahonia, for example, these things that bloom really early is a great way to just extend the overall foraging season, which helps for biodiversity. But I'll pass it over to James from the beekeeper's perspective.
Yeah, no, that's great, and it's important. There are different answers depending on your goal, right? And what does sufficient mean? And I would say for beekeepers, healthy bees is your goal, right? And sufficient in that context means there's something available all the time. And that would be the ideal. Now, as beekeepers, we know that's not the case. Usually there's dearths, things like that we have to deal with. And the other piece of that is the diversity of pollen sources themselves, the different proteins. That is super important. Certain, pollen proteins are more nutritious than others. So there are things you can look at there. And again, having a diverse set of flowers that are producing the pollen are going to give that varied diet that's going to make them more healthy. So um, yeah, I don't think you can determine it from just looking and assessment, but actually you can probably tell from your bees as well. I mean, there's the health of the bees is going to be an indicator of how good the forage is. So that's one of the factors of your bee health is their nutrition, and that's come up a lot actually in a lot of the issues that are going on with bees. Is nutrition is kind of the gateway. Poor nutrition is the gateway for viruses and things like that to get a foothold and to make those other factors become more important, where the bees just don't have the resilience to the viruses or the pesticides or whatever is in their environment, similar to us, as humans. So
Awesome. Perhaps while you're speaking, James, before we jump back into the biodiversity questions, we had a question in the chat from Mary Kay that you might want to be able to answer.
yeah, any advice? Cool them off. Which water is a good way to cool bees on trucks. So that would be they're probably just hot and irritated like you would be if it was super hot. But that would be my quick advice on that. And so just hose them off. That hose off the hives. That helps cool them off if that's a possibility.
Awesome. Okay. Joe, we had a submitted question, 4 and 5. Choose which one. Maybe let's start with I try to make a biodiverse garden and I also try to plant natives. Do you feel one is more important than the other?
Great question, and I think that we can find a middle ground where you don't have to decide between biodiversity and native plant representation. Um, I think you'd be surprised at what level of diversity you can get from focusing on native. And I think thinking about how you define native can really give you that flexibility of what you're looking for. You know, whether you're trying to fill dearths or get something really colorful, or whatever the goal is of the biodiversity. So there's native in terms of your niche habitat. There's native in terms of your maybe your state. There's native in terms of your regionality. Then there's things that are kind of native all across the US. Um, if you're not from the US, however the differentiations in your area would apply. So you can get quite biodiverse while still being native dominant. And the point of planting natives, there's a lot of points. They're well suited, but in this conversation about biodiversity, it's typically because the native plants will support these niche or specialist species in your area. And what we want to do is support those niche and specialist species in your area. So the native plants are a great place to start. If you're looking at adding biodiversity for the sake of biodiversity, I would consider what maybe needs the most support in your area from the biodiversity. So I'm thinking about, I grew up in the PNW, Washington State, and where I grew up was a really unique area that had three different hummingbird species that moved through there at different times of the year. Hummingbirds are almost exclusively attracted to tubular flowers and almost exclusively attracted to red and orange and sometimes yellow flowers. So I would obviously choose to plant as many native things as possible to support the different there's like specific butterflies and specific pollinators in that area that need those really specific floral species. But then if I wanted to bring in other non-natives, I would think about, okay, what's going to help fill the niche and expand the diversity of my garden because of those plant choices. And so again, going back to the example of Washington State, there's a plant called Lobelia tupa. It's from South America, so it's not native, but it makes so many red tubular flowers for such a long season, and it happens to flower in the season that all three of the hummingbird species are passing through the area where I grew up. So you can think about the biodiversity in terms of supporting native species, not just as a standalone species. Um, and really, there's so many great resources out there for different regions that might maybe list what native species support what niche pollinators. I just moved to Georgia. I know that there's, pollinator groups here that tell you these are the top 5 flowers you need to support the niche pollinators in northern Georgia. And once you've kind of got your bases covered there, just have fun with it. I'm guessing the person who put this question in intrinsically enjoys plants. So if you covered your bases with supporting the natives and you've covered your bases with making sure the different niches are covered and you maybe don't have any dearths for pollinators and you've extended the season at the beginning and end, just, yeah, I mean, make sure you like gardening at the end of the day.
Great
Great
advice.
answer.
Awesome, Joe. Well, we have you. The question above, so what are organic approaches for preparing the soil?
Yeah, I got into biodiversity because of soil biodiversity, so I'm so excited someone asked this. Um, the main thing is just making sure you have food for your soil ecosystem. It's really easy to think of just your soil as this layer below the ecosystem, but it's almost its own kind of yin and yang ecosystem connected to what's going on above ground. And so to have the soil function as an ecosystem, you need those different foods. And you probably wanted a fancier answer than this, but compost is the answer. Different types of organic materials breaking down at different rates creates this diversity of different lengths of carbohydrates in the soil, different types of sugar, different types of decomposition. And that's what's going to attract the earthworms. That's what's going to attract the beneficial microbes. That's what's going to attract the mycorrhizal fungi. And you'll get that really rich soil ecology. If you have good soil ecology, there's so much nutrition in the soil that is available. Like once that bacteria and that fungi are cycling the nutrients in the soil, you need progressively less and less amendments to have really healthy soil. If you want like a more fun, weird, like unique answer, I guess, I'm a really big fan of biochar. 1 inch of biochar can provide the same habitat niches as 10 inches of clay soil. So if you're working in pots or you're working in a particularly shallow soils type, an amendment of biochar is fantastic for expanding the sort of like space within the ecology of your soil. It also prevents nutrients from running off during heavy storms. So if you're in an area that gets a lot of rain, you can keep the soil in that top 6 inches, or you can keep the nutrition in the top 6 inches where a lot of roots are using biochar. Biochar is kind of expensive, but it's also extremely easy to make if you have a backyard. I made a biochar oven for like $60 that I can make 20 gallons of biochar in an afternoon in. Um, if you're not that extreme, honestly, just a little bit of biochar goes a long way too.
Now you're making me want to. I've wanted to experiment with biochar, so you're pushing me more and more in that direction. So thank
We
you,
did
Joe.
some we did some rows with and without biochar this year, and you can tell like the plants are just bigger and greener.
Yeah, yeah, cool.
It's biochar, like biology, Biochar, just to Joe in the chat.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. Super interesting. I think maybe we have time for one more question. James, did you
Yeah,
want to?
maybe I'll pick and choose one here. I'm going to go to the single deeps for overwintering question there, and because that's what I do. And at this time of year, where I want to be, I don't worry about necessarily that single deep end state. I need enough space for the bees that are there, but my mind is they're eventually going to end up in a single deep. And so if there is anything above the deep, then I know that that's going to have to eventually be taken off. So I want to begin to work to get the bees down into the single deep. I don't know if that's really an answer. You just don't need to get hung up on getting to the single deep too soon. They will naturally go back into they'll draw the brood nest down. And just in general, if you're newer to beekeeping, or even if you're not, the fall brood nests can sometimes be a bit disorganized looking because there's cycles of brood that are going through, and they'll have brood in an odd place that's finishing up, and then they'll put pollen in closer to the center. It will just get a little out of whack. But know that they'll eventually get it reorganized into their winter configuration, if you will. So I wouldn't stress too much about what that looks like right now, other than just as you're able, reduce the space down. And they're going to naturally do that. You just kind of follow with them and eventually pull that last super off to get them in the single deep. All right. And I wanted one more word on this direction that we have with the biodiversity monitoring. Hopefully you've heard me say this already this year. I mean, we as beekeepers and our bees are continuously sampling the environment around our hives, and we are essentially providing a pollination service to the forage radius of the bees. And I think what you're seeing with what we're doing here is just creating a framework and accounting for that activity that's going on, and saying this is important. This is important activity that you as beekeepers and that the bees are providing. And so let's understand it, understand the impact that it's having, and create a system where you are, I don't want to say compensated, that's too crass, but that you're recognized for this activity that's going on. And we're creating this system that allows that to happen, and creating the data collection systems, things that you're doing already as a beekeeper. I mean, I look at all the plants that are blooming. I look at when they bloom, being able to record when they do that now in the app. Again, it's just another layer of information that helps us as beekeepers be better beekeepers. So again, it's just a side effect of what you're doing already. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't played with those tools yet, just work them into your process. When you go to the yard, or just create a site for your yard at your house and start doing some of this monitoring. It's kind of fun as well.